Fine. Thank you, Peter. I'm Katy Turff. I'm Head of Professional Standards at the Engineering Council, which is the regulatory body for engineers and technicians. And we bring together the professional engineering institutions to set a common framework of standards so that people working in those different disciplines and sectors are at least working to a common core standard, which I think is something that was perhaps suggested for fire risk assessors earlier on in the meeting. I'm Secretary to Working Group 1 on engineers and been working obviously with Scott on Working Group 0 and with Malcolm on some of the work around accreditation. I'm going to not steal Malcolm's thunder and let him say a bit about that. I did want to mention a little bit more about the work on the benchmark competence framework, which I'm also involved in. Clearly this is a key challenge for the Building Safety Competence Committee to make sure that we have something that all of the different frameworks, of which I'm sure there will be numerous, can be checked to make sure they've got a common core. So pulling that together is a real solid piece of work that needs to be done and done quickly. We're looking to pull something together that pulls out the building safety specific competencies from all of the frameworks that you've seen, and I'm sure there will be other things to add to that. So this will provide a shared language and a common set of knowledge, experience, behaviours that we would expect to see and that the Building Safety Competence Committee will expect to see when it looks at frameworks, and which will then allow those bodies to be accredited by a third-party assessor to make sure that they are also assessing competently. So that's all I wanted to say just by way of introduction.
Yes, good morning. Malcolm Hein from UKAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. For those who don't know, we're the national accreditation body. We're appointed by government to assess and accredit any other organisation that carries out any kind of assessment task. So, as Scott so eloquently put it, we check the checkers. So, given the references in Dame Judith's report to the need for accreditation in this area, we were very pleased to be invited to work on these aspects with the Engineering Council to see how accreditation can be applied in this particular area. So the work that we did together came to a number of 4 particular conclusions. One is that all those people working on buildings in scope should meet the competence requirements being developed. 2, that demonstration of competence should be made by an independent organisation, assessment organisation, whether that be a professional institution or other organisations such as a certification body. 3, those organisations themselves should be accredited or licensed through a system such as Engineering Council or UKAS. And then finally, the whole system needs to be overseen by the new Building Safety Committee that is being formed by MHCLG. So the whole system sitting as a coherent whole. So they were our basic conclusions. Our report is part of WG0's report, which is in Raising the Bar consultation process, so you have a good chance to comment. So I'll stop there and we can move to some questions if you like, Peter.
Yeah, fabulous, Malcolm. Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's Ray Cook from HSE. It's less of a question, it's more of support for what Scott was saying. We've heard a lot about individual competence, and we'll continue to hear a lot about individual competence. Absolutely right. The employer needs to be able to demonstrate people who are working for them are competent at whatever they are being asked to do. But that has to sit within that framework of organisational competence and capability. You can have the most competent individual in the world, but if they are working for a really poor employer, they're going to have all sorts of adverse pressures placed on them. So very much emphasising the points, Scott, that you're putting for the COMA example and senior leadership. All of those things that you were reading out about senior leadership are essentially about the organisational capability and competence. That has to be there. That is the golden thread in this instance that underpins everything as far as competency is concerned.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ray. We've got another one down here, please.
Yeah, I've been involved in fire risk assessment since the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order first came into being. And I've gone to see from going into an organisation once and them saying, we don't know what we want, we don't know what we need, we don't know how to get there, can you help us? On an unintelligent-led client, but smart enough to know what they didn't know, to people who think and felt that they know what they have. So my question to you is, I mean, the Competency Council, Sir Ken sat on, did do a list of competencies for risk assessors. I think that there does need to be something of a sort of a shadowing, a mentoring, so that people start off on a lower level and learn more complex buildings as they go along. And that should be something that risk assessors such as myself experience can help those younger ones who are just coming into the market to gain that experience, passing that knowledge down. But really, isn't it time that we also had an auditing system in place? One of the organisations I'm currently doing some work for, a social housing landlord, has got me now doing an annual audit for them of their fire risk management system, so that I look at what actions have been raised, how those actions have been dealt with, what have they done to do it, have they been correctly signed off, the specs that they're looking at, have they right updating the specs? Because if we don't, all that the risk assessment becomes is a document gathering dust.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, and as you acknowledge, there is a fire risk assessment competence framework already out there, and has been out there for a number of years, but I'm not sure that it's ever been fully implemented and fully used. I think it's worth looking at the reasons for that, and our speaker earlier on from MHCLG was challenging industry to make this stick. So I think there are two options here. One is that there must be a groundswell from industry to make sure that this is implemented. But if that's not possible, then I think that there does need to be some structure in the system, if you like, to mandate fire risk assessors to be part of whatever comes out of Working Group 4, and we'll hear about that this afternoon. So I think finding that balance is very important. We know that MHCLG and Dame Judith are looking to industry to respond. Perhaps I'm sticking my head above the parapet. I feel that there will need to be some kind of regulatory underpinning to make this stick.
Scott.
Thank you. Just to add to that, the point you make is an excellent point. Moving the risk assessment out of its silo and ensuring that other individuals across the spectrum of operatives and professionals are aware of risk assessments and understand enough about what a risk assessment is and who a risk assessor is fundamental. And that's what we're trying to achieve with an overarching competence standard that allows each organisation to ask of itself, do we have adequate training about fire risk assessment in our process, in order that our people are made aware of fire risk assessors and the role and the activity and the value of that work in our sector, in our discipline, in our trade. And that will provide the apples and apples comparison across different professions and trades to make sure they are aware of these important activities rather than seeing them isolated and undervalued.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, we've got another question. Oh, okay. Do you want to?
I just wanted to briefly add to that competence on its own, or the competence framework, isn't enough. You need that framework of how that competence is developed. So what underpinning knowledge, how that is developed, how the experience is developed, how that person is mentored and trained, but also how it's revalidated. So it's not just you've got the piece of paper and that's the end of it, but you need to go through a revalidation process, and that's all part of the overall framework that we're...
Good morning, Barry Turner, LABC. We're all here this morning talking about competencies, and I've been involved in a couple of the competency working groups, and I know the painful process that everybody's gone through. One of the things that does concern me, and I think we need to explore further, is the interaction of those competencies as we move forward. And if I may, I would like to use an example of what's happened here this morning. While we were all sat here and Scott was delivering his presentation, there was an alarm went off over there, and I noticed that a colleague of mine who I respect from fire safety went to investigate what that alarm was about. The fact that he came back and sat down again gave me some confidence that there wasn't a problem. But nobody else questioned it, and we're all supposed to be professional people looking at fire safety. And I just wanted to point that out as an example. Thank you.
There we are. Well, competence in action. Fabulous. Okay, have we got time for a couple more? Yes, one.
Pete Dorber, Chair of WG9. We talked a bit about assessing competencies, and I'd be interested in the panel's view about how we then reassess and the frequency of that reassessment to maintain that we are still competent.
Well, I'm happy to kick off on that one. The working groups have recommended various different timescales for reassessment. So anything from 2 years to 5 years. There will be a decision to be made by the Building Safety Competence Committee what it expects to see as the benchmark. So there's an ongoing part of the work is to actually look at what the recommended period should be. There's also the question of how detailed that assessment should be. Is it a full reassessment against every single aspect of competence? How is that performed? Is it essentially the review process completely, or an examination or whatever? Or is it a cut down version of that? How does that manifest itself? So I think there's a lot more to be done to really bottom that out and get to something, but what we will aim for is something which says, as a minimum, this is the expectation. If schemes want to go beyond that minimum and perhaps set a shorter period or be more specific, that will be up to them, but there will be some kind of minimum threshold.
Great. Malcolm?
Yes, and just to add to that point, I think I would say for a UKAS accredited scheme, then we would expect to see those elements very clearly set out in the scheme criteria. And so I would say it would be horses for courses. So although there might be a minimum requirement or a maximum time scale, it would be up to each sector to make their own judgment of how often and how detailed the reassessment needs to be.
Right. Scott?
And just to finally just keep remembering that there are two things going on here, and the principal thing from government perspective, the Secretary of State downwards, the principal thing is to avoid ever again having that low probability, high consequence disaster. That's the principal thing. The fact that we can piggyback on that to some extent to build the basic competence is a further value, but there are two things to happen.
Hi, I'm Sandra Ashcroft from the Health and Safety Executive. I just wanted to pick up on the point that you're saying about where competence fits into the whole of the framework for avoiding low probability, high competence incidents. I've been working very closely with MHCLG to look at that. For the inoculation, it's going to be a safety case, and the safety case is something where the accountable person, the building safety manager, for example, would show that they are doing everything possible to reduce the likelihood of a major incident. And that would have to have a lot of evidence to demonstrate that. And part of that would be your competence story of what you have accepted certain documents in the way that they have that demonstrate that safety. So things like the risk assessors that have been referred to, you would be looking at more closely. And to back that up, the regulator would assess those safety cases in occupation and to check that you are demonstrating as far as you can that you're reducing the risks of a major incident as low as is reasonably practicable. So there will be checks and balances within the system that help to drive up the competence and ensure that it isn't just somebody with a certificate that's saying that they're a fire risk assessor when all they've ever done is looked at lower risk buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point to actually bring things to a close. Thank you very much.